All right, welcome to Guide to the Old Testament, Week 3. This is part 1 of reading Genesis. So we can go ahead and fill in our first blank while we're at it. Today we're studying the book of Genesis. Now, Genesis is the only book that we're going to split into two parts as we study through the Old Testament. That's because it's one of the longest books of the Bible, and it's also certainly the most foundational books of the Old Testament. In terms of you really have to understand what's going on in Genesis, or you're going to have a lot of trouble following what comes afterward. And so we are going to split it up into two parts. So today we're looking at Genesis chapters 1 through 12, basically. And hopefully you remember from our slideshow, our theme for this book is creation and covenant. So creation referring to kind of that first part of the book where God creates the world and the fall and everything that comes after that. And covenant referring to the covenant with Abraham that really drives the second half of this book. Let's talk about some basic facts for this book. Genesis is written by Moses, which is like at least approximately true. So when it comes to the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, they're consistently attributed to Moses by Jewish tradition and also by the New Testament. It doesn't mean there's no parts of these books that were written by someone else, right? Like the part where Moses dies, it'd be awfully hard for him to write that. But certainly the bulk of the book, he's responsible for it, and so we're writing him down as the author. Secondly, the book of Genesis is structured by a genealogy. All right, you can kind of think of it as following a family tree that goes from Adam to then the 12, all the way down to the 12 sons of Jacob or Israel. And along the way, as we go through the family tree, we pause and look at stories of different people within that tree. So the next thing we're going to do, similar to what we did last week, and this will be our pattern when we're looking at individual books, to talk about the facts of a certain book, to talk about the shape of that book over here. We'll draw something out, and also to talk about the reward. The reward being, what are some of the reasons you might read this book? What are some of the spiritual lessons that we're going to be learning as we give our attention to it? But let's turn now to the shape of Genesis 1 through 12. So first let's divide this first block in half, okay? And then we're going to be observing a repeating pattern through the rest of these blocks. So this first block, ignore for now. For the rest of them, we're going to do a repeating pattern of sin and judgment and hope. Sin, judgment, hope. So let's keep going. Sin and sin and sin. Judgment, judgment, and judgment. And then last, hope, hope, and hope. So that's the sort of rhythm of these 11, 12 chapters of Genesis that helps us keep track of where we are. So we're going to begin up here. Of course, Genesis 1 is the story of God's good creation. We've already talked about this some last week. That repeated refrain that's so important as God creates the world, that he saw that it was good. Right? And specifically meaning that the creation that God made was good for humans. And he made things that allowed us to flourish. And of course, in Genesis 1, this is famously divided up into 6 days. Or 7 if you count the day of rest. So, day 1 we separate the light from the dark. Day 2 we separate the waters from the waters. I won't draw them all out because I can't draw them all. But the last day then is a day of rest where God dwells in and fills up his creation with his presence, and it's all very good. Now, in Genesis 2, and you know what, let's write what chapters we're talking about over here. So right here we've got chapters 1 and 2. Genesis 2, we zoom in. So here we're talking specifically about the humans God created, Adam and Eve, although Eve has not been named yet in the story. And they are in a garden, which is in the land of Eden. And within the garden, there are lots of animals and plants, but most specifically, there are 2 trees, which I'm sure you've heard of, that are very important to the story. They're the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, the tree of life, what it does is, if you eat from the tree, from some of its fruit, you're granted eternal life. You get to live forever. And Adam and Eve are allowed to do that, right? They're allowed to eat from that tree and live forever with God in the garden, and it's a good life. But what they're not supposed to do is eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. This is one of the questions, I think, on your homework. But the point being that God has already told Adam and Eve what is good for them. That's his job to decide what benefits them and what doesn't. He's also said, for example, to Adam, it's not good for the man to be alone. And so the job of Adam and Eve here is to help God rule the world and spread his glory throughout the world, but to do so without trying to take his spot as the people who decide what is good and what is evil. They need to let God be God, and they're going to be under him. But of course, that's not what they do, and in chapter 3, we get the story of the fall. Let's draw us a snake, a serpent. The serpent was craftier than all the beasts of the field. So he comes to Eve, and he tells her, no, you aren't going to die if you eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. God's trying to keep something good back from you. You should try to take his place. You should eat from that tree. And unfortunately, Eve believes them. Believes the snake, I should say. And there's a key phrase we need to notice in this story because it's familiar to us, and it's when Eve looks at that fruit as she's about to eat it. It says that she saw that it was good. Some translations will have it as beautiful or some other word, but it's the same word in Hebrew as we had back up here where God saw that his creation was good. And so you can see even in the story the way that Eve is taking God's place, and of course she invites Adam to do so as well. And as a result, they're removed from the garden. This is one of your discussion questions up here, by the way. What are the consequences of Adam and Eve's sin according to Genesis 3? And there's plenty, right? There's pain in childbirth. There's hard labor for Adam. There's death. And all of these, I think, should be understood under kind of the rubric of exile. That whereas previously Adam and Eve were with God and they were experiencing his glory, right? This was a good place for them to be in his presence. Now they're sent away from that blessing and that presence. And these results of death and the ground being unfruitful and pain in childbirth are kind of the results of that. But even in this moment of judgment, when we get to the curse on the serpent, we get a glimmer of hope already. Because we hear about one day an offspring of the woman, it says, who will crush the head of the serpent. So the serpent will strike his heel, but this offspring is going to crush him underfoot. And really, that word offspring is like the catchphrase of the book of Genesis. It's maybe the most important word that connects us ahead to the promises to Abraham of land and offspring and blessing. And it starts all the way back here in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, which is why that verse is sometimes called the proto-evangelium, the first announcement of the gospel, the one who would crush the serpent. So following that story, as Adam and Eve are exiled from the garden, we get another story of sins. This is the story in chapter 4. Oh, I better write my chapter numbers. This is also chapter 3. This is also chapter 3. Now we're here in chapter 4. And we get the story here in chapter 4 of Cain and Abel. So Cain and Abel make offerings to God on an altar. This is an altar, if you couldn't tell. And they have two different things, so let me get this straight. Cain brings some of his produce from the field. We'll pretend it was an apple, because I can draw an apple. Nice, beautiful apple. I'm going to pat myself on the back. Whereas Abel brings something from the flock, right, an animal. And Abel's offering is accepted, and Cain is not. And as a result, Cain gets very jealous of Abel, and he kills Abel. So there's your next major sin, first murder in the Bible. Abel is now sad. Let's draw an angry Cain over him. He's got like a rock or something. I look too happy, but oh well. So this is a major sin, and the judgment is actually very similar to what happened to Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve were kicked out of the garden to the east, yeah, that's right. And Cain has to wander even farther east. So Cain is exiled, and he becomes a wanderer on the earth. In fact, it says he went to live in the land of Nod, which means wandering. So this is also the end of chapter 4. Now, as we get into chapters 4 and 5, we get back to some elements of hope, because it says that Adam and Eve had another child. It says this was yet another offspring. So this is in the place of Abel, the son who died, and it takes us back to this hope up here of an offspring that will crush the serpent. And we get here one of those genealogies that we said structured the book, as we kind of trace the generations of these various characters. And pretty quickly we arrive at another element of sin, another section of the story that deals with sin. And there's some question here about what exactly the sin is. This is that famous passage you may have heard of with the Nephilim, right? This is in Genesis 6 now. Sometimes this is taken to be kind of marriage between angels and humans that produce this kind of superhuman offspring. Sometimes it's taken to be a mixing of Cain's line with Adam's and Seth's line. It's a bit debated, but in any case, the result is that there's violence and corruption in the earth. So you don't get so much like a specific incident like, oh, Cain killed Abel, there's the sin. But you get more this general description of how the whole earth and all of humanity is corrupt. This is that famous verse that, if I can quote it, every intention of his heart was only evil continually. So the total depravity of humans, their rebellion against God. And so we get a major instance of judgment where only one... Shucks. All right, sorry about that. So we get this major instance of judgment now where only one man and his family is saved. That's, of course, Noah. Now, here I've made an invisible ark because you can see the water through it, but oh well. Okay. And this is seen as kind of a cleansing of the earth, right? The whole earth is cleansed by this water, and all flesh perishes except Noah and his family. But again, an offspring is preserved, and that's what we're kind of keeping track of as we follow this family line. So this is in chapters it's blue. This is in chapters 7 and 8 where we're getting that. And then really it's kind of 8 and 9 where we see this element of hope. And again, we have a sacrifice being made, this time by Noah, after the ark lands on Mount Ararat. And God promises that never again will he have that kind of complete destruction by water on the earth. Which in other words is a commitment that God's going to stick to his promises and he's going to redeem this earth rather than destroying it and starting over again. Okay? And the symbol of that, and this is going to be a tough one to draw, is the rainbow, right? So he puts his bow in the sky. It says, I've got to do my famous Roy G. Biv. Am I doing this in the right order? I don't know. I don't even have a purple one up right now. You're just going to have to be content with that. So that's where we get this renewal of a covenant with Noah. Here in chapter 9 especially. And there is a story in here that doesn't fit the pattern very well, which is Noah getting drunk and his nakedness is uncovered. And this kind of leads to the introduction of the Canaanites as an enemy in the story of the Old Testament. We're going to pass over that. You can read it for yourself. But the next major incident of sin in this section of the Old Testament is the building of the Tower of Babel. Okay, and maybe I should make the hope here last through chapter 10. Chapter 10 doesn't fit very well in either one, but here, Tower of Babel is in chapter 11. Okay, so this is an attempt where the people, humans, have been excluded from God's presence since the Garden of Eden. And this is an attempt by them, it seems, to try to sort of get back into God's space by force. They're going to build a tower up to heaven, They're going to make a name for themselves so they won't be scattered all over the earth. So it's an act of rebellion against God, no matter how you think of it. And this is called the Tower of Babel. And for whatever reason, that's how this word gets translated in this passage, chapter 11 of Genesis. Everywhere else in the Hebrew Bible, we translate that as Babylon. This is the same word as Babylon, that kind of famous enemy of Israel that will eventually take them into exile many thousands of years later. And so we get this major judgment on Babel or Babylon. And in the Babylonian language, Babylon means the gate of heaven, which kind of makes sense with this story as they're trying to build their way up into heaven. But in the judgment story, we get this kind of play on that name because what God does is he takes these builders and confuses their language so they can't talk to each other anymore. They're all speaking different languages, and it makes a pun. So in Hebrew, you have the word Babel, is spelled like this, Beit Lamed, and it says that at Babel was where God confused their languages. And confuse is spelled like this, Beit Lamed Lamed. So you can see it's a pun that is being made there. And as a result of this, all these nations are scattered throughout the earth, all these peoples, all these new families. And the response to that, the hope that we see then, is, as we talked about last week, is the covenant with Abraham, or Abram. The promise by God to give him land and offspring and blessing. And notice this blessing that God promises, as we talked about, it's for all the peoples of the earth. So that goes right back to what we've just seen here, where the peoples of the earth were scattered about. Now God is on a mission to rescue all of them and bring them back into the place where he wants to bless them as his people. And so the final installment in this sin, judgment, hope pattern is the covenant with Abraham that really carries forward the rest of the story of Genesis and ultimately the whole Bible. This is when God's major rescue plan is announced. These three promises are what's going to take us back to the Garden of Eden. And it's no coincidence that this key word offspring is used yet again, because there's this idea that Abraham has, on the one hand, a numerous offspring. He's going to be a great nation. He's going to have many descendants, but that also he's connected with this singular offspring right here, who's going to crush the head of the serpent and provide ultimate redemption. So that's the shape of these 11 chapters. Oh, we still need to spell out a couple chapter numbers here. In general, we can characterize it, beginning here in chapter 3, with this kind of downward spiral of increasing sin and destruction and chaos, but also with interspersed with these marks of hope. Hope for the future, right? Those are supposed to be stars. They're not very good. So let's talk about the reward. What's the payoff if you decide to read this section of Scripture carefully for yourself and study it? What kind of things are you going to see? One is you're going to see God's power. Here I'm thinking of Genesis 1, Genesis 2, the way that God, the God that we know in Jesus, the God who we pray to, is the one who spoke the world into existence by his word, right? Which is Jesus. He says, "Let there be light," and there was light. Pretty remarkable description of the God that we serve. Lots to meditate on, lots to think about there just in Genesis 1. Also God's wisdom. And here I'm thinking about this phrase that we kept mentioning, that God saw that it was good versus when Eve saw that it was good. What Genesis teaches us, and these first few chapters teach us in particular, is that God actually knows what's best for us. He's the one who created us, and the instructions and design he has for our life is for our flourishing, our blessing, our good. We can trust his wisdom in that way. We also get a really powerful study in sin in these chapters. So we see sin as rejecting God's rule rather than ruling the earth under him and submitting to him and helping the earth to flourish. It's trying to take his place, trying to be like him in a way that's inappropriate. We see sin as trusting our own wisdom instead of listening to what God says is good and evil we take that into our own hands. It's if we ourselves eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. We also see sin as a downward spiral. We see the way that it spins out of control and takes us farther than we want to go and causes more destruction than we could predict. So here you get some really good and beautiful reward, and also some warning to think through about what sin is. All right, let's take a quick look at our homework for next week. We're going to be listening to several passages from the second half of Genesis here, and we have 4 questions to answer. As always, you can listen to those on BibleGateway.com. If you want to find the handout, you can look at ebcxenia.churchcenter.com/groups, and it should be there. Let me know if you have any questions.